Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on legal philosophy. Specifically, we're taking a look at Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law. And to help us with this, we've got a stack of sources here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's surprisingly dense stuff, I gotta say.
Yeah, it can be pretty heady stuff, but Kelsen was really brilliant. You see, he wasn't just trying to understand specific laws or legal systems. He was trying to get at the very essence of law itself, like what makes law law. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like trying to explain what a chair is to
Yeah.
someone who's never seen one before. I mean, we all know what a chair is, but if you had to define it purely without pointing to examples or making comparisons, it gets
Yeah,
tricky.
totally. And that's exactly what Kelsen was going for. He wanted to strip away all the political baggage and moralizing that often gets tangled up with law and just understand it in its purest form.
So let's start with the basics then. Who was this Hans Kelsen guy, and what was the big problem he was trying to solve?
Well, Kelsen was a really influential Austrian jurist and philosopher. He developed this pure theory of law in the early 20th century. And one of his main concerns was that a lot of other legal theories at the time were either too tied up with specific political ideologies, or they kind of oversimplified things by reducing law to sociology or other disciplines. He wanted to create a theory of law that was truly pure, a framework that could help us understand law on its own terms.
So it sounds like he was looking for the legal equivalent of a mathematical equation,
Yeah.
Formula that could capture the essence of law without all the extra messy variables.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the core problem that Kelsen was wrestling with was how to explain what makes law, well, law, like what gives it its authority. Why do we feel obligated to follow it?
Right, because it's one thing to have a set of rules, but what gives them the power to actually bind us? Why should I care about what some piece of paper says, even if it's called a law?
Exactly. And Kelsen wanted to answer these questions without resorting to explanations from ethics or politics or morality. He believed that law had its own internal logic, its own kind of unique way of operating.
So how did he go about building this pure theory of law? Where did he even start?
Well, Kelsen started with this pretty bold idea. Law is fundamentally a system of norms, and these norms aren't just descriptions of how people behave, but they're prescriptive statements about how people ought to behave. You see the difference there.
So it's not just about what people do, but what they're supposed to do.
Exactly. And for Kelsen, the key to understanding law is understanding how these norms all fit together, how they create a coherent system. He argued that legal norms get their validity from other legal norms in kind of a hierarchical structure.
So it's like a pyramid with each level of norms getting its authority from the level above it.
Exactly. Think of it like this. A local ordinance gets its validity from the city charter, which gets its validity from the state constitution, which gets its authority from the federal constitution.
Okay, so it's like a chain of command, but for laws. But then what gives the very top of this chain, like the federal constitution, in your example, its authority? Where does it all begin?
That's where things get really interesting. You see, Kelsen realized that he can't just keep going up the chain forever, right? There has to be a starting point, a fundamental norm that doesn't get its validity from any other norm. And he called this the basic norm.
So the basic norm is like the bedrock of the legal system, the
Yeah.
ultimate source of authority for all the other laws.
Precisely. It's the unauthorized authorizer, the rule, that kicks off the whole chain of legal validity.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this basic norm idea, but how do we even know what the basic norm is? Is it written down somewhere, or is it more like an abstract concept?
Yeah, that's one of the really fascinating things about Kelsen's theory. He argued that the basic norm isn't some concrete thing you can point to, like a document or a specific law. It's more like a presupposition and assumption that we kind of have to make sense of the whole legal system.
So are you saying we just have to take it on faith that this basic norm exists?
Not quite faith, but more like it's a necessary condition for a legal system to even be possible. Think about the rules of a game. You can't play chess unless you assume that the pieces move in certain ways and that there's a point to the game, right? The basic norm is kind of like that. It's the set of fundamental assumptions that make it possible for us to play the game of law.
Okay, I see how that ties into the whole idea of law as a system.
hmm
But if the basic norm isn't written down anywhere, how do we know what it is? How do we figure out its content?
Well, Kelsen said that the content of the basic norm comes from the actual practices of a society. It's what some legal scholars call the rule of recognition. Basically, the basic norm is whatever rule is actually being followed and enforced as the ultimate source of legal authority in that particular society.
So it's not about some abstract moral principle, but about what's actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. Let's say, for example, you have a country with a long history of following a monarch. In that society, the basic norm might be something like obey the king's commands. But then, let's say a revolution happens and the people establish a republic. Well, then the basic norm would shift to something like obey the laws of the republic.
So the basic norm can change over time. It's not fixed.
Right. And that's what makes Kelsen's theory kind of radical. He's basically saying that law is ultimately grounded in social facts, in what people are actually doing and accepting as authoritative.
You know, that brings up something I've been thinking about. If the basic norm is based on social facts, isn't Kelsen just reducing law to sociology? I thought he wanted to create a pure theory of law separate from other disciplines.
That's a really sharp observation, and it points to one of the big debates about Kelsen's work. Some critics say that by relying on social facts, he's kind of undermining his whole claim to purity. Like he's sneaking in sociological concepts through the back door.
So is Kelsen's theory a failure then? Did he end up collapsing law into sociology after all?
Not necessarily. Kelsen argued that while the content of the basic norm comes from social facts, the concept of the basic norm is still a purely legal idea. It's a necessary presupposition for understanding law as a system of norms, no matter what the specific content of those norms happens to be.
Okay, I think I'm following. So even though the basic norm is based on what people are actually doing, it's still a distinct legal concept because it's what gives those actions their legal meaning.
Exactly. It's like the difference between watching a game and actually playing it. You can
Yeah.
describe what's happening in a football game, players running around throwing a ball. But to understand it as football, you need to understand the rules, the goals, the whole logic of the game.
That's a really helpful analogy. But I still have this one big question. If the basic norm is just a presupposition, why should we accept it at all? What makes us want to play the game of law?
Ah, that gets right to the heart of Kelsen's whole exploration of legal normativity, the sense of obligation we have towards the law. And to understand that, he says we need to adopt what he calls the legal point of view.
The legal point of view, huh? Sounds kind of mysterious. So what does it actually mean to adopt this legal point of view? Is it like putting on some special glasses that makes everything look like a law textbook?
Yeah, that's not a bad way to think about it. Adopting the legal point of view basically means you're seeing the world through the lens of that basic norm we were talking about. You're interpreting actions and events in terms of what they mean legally, how they fit into that whole system of norms that makes up a legal order.
So it's more than just knowing the laws. It's about understanding that whole framework that gives them meaning.
Right. Think about a lawyer arguing a case in court. They're not just reciting statutes, they're interpreting those statutes, applying them to specific situations, and making arguments within the context of that accepted legal framework. That's the legal point of view in action.
But hang on a sec. Does that mean if you adopt the legal point of view, you just have to blindly accept every law, even if you think it's totally unjust or wrong?
That's a great question, and it's something that Kelsen definitely recognized. He knew there could be tension between our own personal moral beliefs and what the legal system demands, but he said that the legal point of view doesn't require you to just throw away your moral compass. It just asks you to try to understand the legal system on its own terms, to see how it works as its own separate system of norms.
Okay, so it's like being able to appreciate a painting even if you don't personally like what it's depicting. Like you can recognize the skill and the complexity without necessarily agreeing with the message.
Exactly. You can analyze a law from a legal point of view,
Mhm.
understanding where it fits in the system and what it means without necessarily agreeing with it morally. In fact, Kelsen actually thought that being able to separate our moral judgments from our legal analysis was really important for keeping the legal system running smoothly.
I can see that. It makes sense. It allows for more objectivity and consistency than if everyone was always interpreting the law through their own personal moral lens. But it still leaves me wondering, why should we bother playing this game at all? Why adopt the legal point of view if we don't have to?
That's the million-dollar question that Kelsen leaves us with. He gives us this really neat framework for understanding how law works, how it creates obligations and punishments, but he doesn't tell us why we should actually buy into this system. It's almost like he's saying, here's the map of the legal landscape. Now it's up to you to decide where you want to go and what paths you want to take.
So he gives us the tools, but leaves the choices up to us.
Right, and that's part of what makes Kelsen's theory so thought-provoking and relevant even today. It really pushes us to think critically about what law is, what its role in society is, and how each of us relates to the legal systems we live under.
It's definitely given us a lot to think about. So just to recap, Kelsen's pure theory of law basically tries to explain law as a self-contained system of norms with this thing called the basic norm acting as the ultimate source of authority.
And to really understand how this system works, Kelsen says we need to adopt the legal point of view, which lets us see the world through this lens of legal meaning and interpret actions within their legal context.
But Kelsen kind of leaves that big question of why we should accept this system unanswered, right? He wants us to wrestle with those deeper philosophical questions about where law gets its power and authority from.
Yeah, exactly. So next time you come across a law, try to see it in the context of that Kelsenian hierarchy we talked about. Think about where it fits in, trace it back to that basic norm, and ask yourself, what makes this law valid? And maybe even more importantly, why do I choose to accept it?
Well, we hope this deep dive into Kelsen's pure theory of law has got your wheels turning and sparked your curiosity about legal philosophy. There's always more to learn, more to question, more to discover. Until next time, keep on diving.